We are now pleased to welcome to the show Mr. Bud Elliott, National Recruiting Analyst from 247 Sports. Bud, welcome to the PFF College Football Podcast. Chilling.
Dude, I listened to a couple in the car the other day. I was enjoying it.
You guys are friends because Diante was on your podcast. I wasn't invited. That's fine. It doesn't matter. We don't have to get into that right now. But like, you know, Bud, I've known you through Twitter for 2-3 years now, 4 years, something like that. And you are one of the national voices for recruiting in the whole country. So that's why we had to have you on, because signing day just happened. And we need to know, because I think, you know, I speak for myself here. I don't know shit all about recruiting. And maybe I should, considering college football is my job. But I'm hoping you can teach me a few things today.
All right. So where do you guys want to start? I mean, there's a lot to know about recruiting.
What is a recruit, Bud?
So before we do dive into some of the more serious stuff, I've listened to you speak about this, but I would love for you to explain it to our audience. Your hat science when it comes to kids committing, and how you kind of break down which way you think a kid's going to lean. So
this all was kind of born out of pre-Slack. We had something called Campfire at SB Nation, which was, you know, kind of like a in-house chat client, and we would watch the announcements back when I was with SB Nation, my prior place of employment, and I would predict where these kids were going based on what their hats looked like on the table, and I was pretty accurate at it. And Jason Kirk, my editor at the time, was like, "Dude, you got to write this up. This is hilarious. Like look for the factors." And so I did, and we basically just called it like hat decision science, right? Like kids have these announcement ceremonies where they have all the hats on the table, and you got to figure out, you know, where they're going to go based on the hats. And there's some kind of hard and fast rules that you need to follow. If the hat looks like the kid just bought it at the gas station, and the rest of the hats don't, he's not picking that one, right? Yep. Like, you got to think he's going to have photos. This is going to be on his Snap, on his Instagram, on his TikTok, etc. He's going to want to look nice for when he puts on that, especially if he's doing this on national TV, like, you know, on CBS HQ or ESPN or wherever. So first of all, like comparative analysis of the quality of the hats, right? And then if you know the kid a little bit, understand, like, is he a flat bill kid? Is he a kid, you know, who, for instance, the other day, Tywone Malone, who's one of the better baseball prospects in the country as well, big 310-pound first baseman who hits the crap out of the ball, like Frank Thomas type look, just, oh my gosh. I was like, okay, well, he's probably going to want to, because I know he's going to play both sports in college. Which hats on his table have the school's baseball logo? Because I thought it'd be kind of cool to, and so 3 of them did. I was like, all right, well, now we're cooking with gas here, right? And we narrowed it down a little bit, and then I looked at it, and Tyrone has the real high top fade haircut. I'm like, all right, so this hat has to have some real depth to it. And
some give.
Which hat do you think has been tried on? And I looked at him. I looked at A&M. I looked at Florida State, and I looked at Ole Miss. And Ole Miss was much taller. It looked like somebody, because, you know, when you buy a hat from the store, it's kind of got that pre-fold in it.
Yep.
You got to shake it out. Well, the other two had not really been shaken out, but this one looked like it had been worked a little bit. It was flat bill, but it wasn't completely flat billed. And I was like, all right, that's been tried on. Like, Tywone has sat in the mirror and said, all right, this looks good. I got it adjusted up. And so from that, I predicted he was going to go to Ole Miss, and he did. So that's kind of hat size. You got to, is he the type of kid who, some of the dudes actually leave the stickers on all but one of the hats, or they take the stickers off all but one, which is a pretty easy tell. Those are kind of key metrics here to look at when doing the hat science.
All right. Yeah, well, that's absolutely the end of the podcast. That's all. That's honestly, that's all I needed to know, and I'm good for the next 5 years. Yeah.
Also,
anyway,
sometimes mom's clothes will give it away.
Yes.
Like if she's color coordinated, even if the kid's wearing the jacket, he's going to unzip it and show where he's going. The mom typically is going to color coordinate.
Yeah. Diante, do you have a recruiting story? Like, when you pick Sac State, like, did you do a hat thing? Did you just like slip a piece of paper on someone's door? How did that work?
So no, what's funny is, so I was a post signing day kid, my senior year in high school. I had a few things. I had some issues with clearinghouse because of summer school credits that I had made up, and this happens pretty often, especially like with kids who are kind of like at the FCS level, G5 level, or kids who maybe are mixing up their schedule or had a rough freshman year and they're trying to make up units to kind of get themselves back in the picture. That was kind of my path through it. So I had a few visits that were scheduled that ended up being put on hold because they were trying to work out my clearinghouse stuff. And then all this stuff kind of stacked on top of each other all at once. So the schools that were interested in me all wanted a visit the same weekend. And I could only choose one. So I chose Sac State because that was closest. And I figured, hey, I'll stay in contact with some of these other schools if they still have an opening, for me to come visit, a couple weeks later, maybe I can circle back around. And I went to Sac State, and when I went there at first, there wasn't really much of an interest in offering me, or it was going to be very limited. And I visited, sat in the weight room, spoke with a few of the guys, and then later that night, after I had dinner with then linebackers coach and now head coach at Boise State, Andy Avalos, we were kind of talking about what the future looked like, how the defense worked, and all that. And then he called me after that and said, "Hey, we're going to meet with the head coach. He's got some time for you." So I go in, meet, sit with him, shake his hand, and I remember it was a very short conversation. He kind of asked me how I was feeling about the process, what I was thinking. I wanted to stay as close to home as I could, and he just slid this binder over. It kind of had all of my information, their goals for me, short-term, long-term, the way that the academic program was going to work out for me based on what I wanted to major in. And then at the very last page, it was an offer sheet. So they had actually found enough money to cover my tuition, take up a little piece of my room and board, pay for books and all that. And, the way that they do in the recruiting process, when they find some money for you that they weren't anticipating, it's a right now or go home and thanks for coming type of thing. So I was kind of up against it, but I was happy with the way they had kind of, talked to me throughout the process. I had a feeling that the linebacker coach I had was a pretty good guy, and I committed on the spot there. So signed about a couple days later, and that was it. But it's a fun process. I love talking recruiting. I coach, so I'm around a lot of these kids, and around that sophomore to junior year is when you kind of get a feel for where you're at, or where you might be. So, I love talking about this kind of stuff.
Sorry, I have one recruiting story. So we had a kid once. It kind of reminds me of what you're talking about, Diante. But we had a kid once, good prospect. I believe he was going to Buffalo. Buffalo comes and recruits our area pretty hard. A lot of Montrealers, a lot of Quebecers. It's like Buffalo, Syracuse, UMass. Those are like the three big ones. Boston College has taken a couple kids over the years. So the kid, from what I understood, and he was a defensive guy and I was quarterback coach. We didn't talk that much, but from what I understood is that he was going to Buffalo. It's going to happen. Hawaii called and was like, "We want to offer you." On the phone, he was like, "Sure, yeah, let's do it." And I was like, you know what? If Hawaii calls me, I'm going to Hawaii. Like, I'm not debating between. I've been to Buffalo. I like the city of Buffalo. I'm not debating between Buffalo and like Honolulu. It's not happening. Anyways, you guys take it away. I'm staying out of this from now on.
All right. So, but some of these questions kind of come out of like a half-informed opinion of my own from talking to some kids. I'm kind of involved in some of the 7-on-7 stuff. I coach at the high school level, so I have these conversations with coaches. But throughout the recruiting cycle, obviously there are a lot of mitigating factors. Number one being a global pandemic, that kind of forces everybody to be inside and changes timelines for everything. But I was wondering for you, especially, in your area or just around the South, because there is such a high concentration of G5 and P5 programs, do you think that more kids were committing within like a 100 to 200 mile radius of home because of the pandemic, or were kids still trying to keep their recruiting pretty open?
I definitely think kids were committing closer to home. We saw this with a couple notable examples. I know Barton wrote it up probably in May, I think is when we really started to realize, okay, two things are afoot here. Number one, a lot of kids are panicking and grabbing spots early. Yeah. Like we saw commitments pacing, I mean, several hundred commitments ahead of where we were normally in prior years. I was able to kind of backtrack and look into our database and say, okay, well, we didn't have 1,000 kids committed by this point. Last year we had like 600. So we were well ahead of pace. The other thing we saw was kids were largely committing to schools they had already visited to the extent they could control that process. And where had they already visited, for the most part, they had visited schools that were very close to home. Economically, there's an issue where a lot of these kids can't really afford to go visit schools far away from home until their official visit, right? The official visit, usually late in the process, although we do allow them in spring now, as of 2019. Those are paid for by the school, but all other visits are not supposed to be paid for by the school. So typically, you have to do that on your own dime. Sometimes the kids are fortunate enough to be able to, there's bus tours that some of these 7-on coaches in the South lead, and they'll go, they'll start up 75 and they'll hit Tallahassee, Baton Rouge, up to Mississippi schools, Auburn, Bama, Tennessee, cut down, Georgia, Florida, back down to Miami. Those didn't really happen this year. So Barton was honest. He's like, look, I think Miami's going to clean up this year because of how many kids are close to home. Maybe some gems that are run down there by Miami alum, that type of thing. So they're getting indoctrinated into that. So definitely, I think kids committed earlier. They committed to what they already knew. And in many cases, they never got to visit the school they were going to if they committed to a school they had never visited, because visits didn't open back up. We know some schools have classes where over half of their commitments never visited. And if you're a coach, you're a little bit uneasy about taking this many kids, as we saw with the reduced numbers of actual signees this year.
Right. Yeah. So if you're a kid that's in Miami right now, maybe you're a 3-star, high 3-star, maybe low 4-star receiver, and maybe you could get a look at Michigan. It's probably not happening for you through 2020 if you're not already on their radar, right? If you're not somebody that they had already kind of, had their eye on your freshman, sophomore year, maybe you went to a tournament, like some 7-on-7 thing in North Carolina or Maryland or something where all these paths would cross and you'd be on their radar, chances are you're probably not getting that visit before the pandemic started. And then, like you said, you're probably going to stay closer to home, or at least closer to what you are already familiar with. I can see how trying to forge those new relationships with kids is difficult, under these circumstances.
Also, parents, I think, given the uncertainty about where we were going as a planet, probably wanted their kids a little bit closer to home.
Absolutely.
If we have an unprecedented pandemic, I don't know if you're a mom from Miami, if you want your kid going, nothing against PJ Fleck, but that's not a car ride. I can't go pick my kid up. I got to fly up there.
Exactly.
Let's live in a world where I'm being very optimistic here, but let's say springtime comes, vaccinations have been rolling out. We're all good. We're starting to really get back to a real society everywhere in the United States and Canada. Does all this stuff that happened during the pandemic affect the next class? I'm sure it does, but I guess how much does it?
It does. It's multifaceted, though. So normally schools are putting together their recruiting boards based on junior tape, right? What you did as a junior, what you did as a sophomore, but also how you looked at their summer camp, right? Mm-hmm. How they thought you looked when they visited your school in the fall, or when they visited your school for your school spring practice, back in the prior spring. Well, those opportunities for evaluation have all been wiped out. So they're really behind the 8 ball as far as in-person evaluations, and I think you can do a lot on tape. But specifically when you're dealing with kids, where you are in your quest to win the puberty lottery is different for each player. And I think it really does make sense to shake a kid's hand and see, you see him next to their mom and dad, and I'm like, oh, okay, this guy might be huge. I look at Jordan Battle and his dad Fred, the Alabama safety, right? Mm-hmm. I was like, all right, well, I'm very, very happy to project Jordan extremely high, because even if he outgrows safety, his dad's probably 6'5", 260. So, really good athlete too. I'm like, okay, this is a kid who is going to be able to be a very good player, probably at linebacker as well, if he had to move, to that. So seeing kids in person, I think, has been a big deal. The other thing is that, and this gets into some real kind of nerdery, but we can go here quickly, I think. So for the 2021 season, right, all of your super seniors. So the seniors that got their bonus year due to COVID, because the NCAA had to entice people to play, because a lot of kids didn't want to play if they were going to be wasting their year on this kind of, bastardization of a season that we just had. Well, everybody gets a free year now. So all your super seniors who have decided to come back and take advantage of their extra year do not count against your overall cap of 85 scholarships for the 2021 cycle. So you can carry 95 kids if 10 of them are super seniors. Next year, there is no indication that that's going to happen. So everybody still gets their free year, but all these schools are too cheap or don't have the money to pay that extra year, according to them. So you're going to have to be, as a staff, back down to 85. So basically, for every additional super senior you elect to keep for 2022, that's going to be one fewer recruit that you can take in the class of 2022. So the battle for spots is going to be really fierce.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense? I know it's kind of a lot of regulation stuff, but it's going to be a cramped class this year.
And that's something that I've had conversations as a coach with other coaches, is kind of where that leaves some of the late bloomer types, kids who would maybe clean up on offers, around February, when a school, maybe like a G5 or a lower tier P5 school, says, hey, maybe we thought we had a shot at this high 3-star kid, and now all of a sudden, we don't have a shot at the guy. Now we have an extra scholarship offer we weren't anticipating. Let's just hand it off to the next kid just to make sure we fill this thing out. That with that not being as much of a viable option, I can see how that changes things. We talked with our kids about, being realistic about some kids who are those late bloomers. You might have to do junior college, because you're not going to get that look. Either that or you're going to have to kind of eat it and maybe go to a level of football that you're not happy playing at, and then maybe try to get in the portal later on down the line after you got some college credits built up and some tape in college built up, and see if you can make it work that way.
And this year, and for next year, you better have some kind of grades to go JUCO, because the junior college coaches we're talking to now are telling us that they are not having to scrape bottom of the barrel academically for their kids this year. So like they're the normally, the junior college kids you're taking are oftentimes pretty questionable academically, right? Or they're kids who need to keep growing, that maybe their late bloomers didn't get noticed. They feel like they go JUCO and then go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Now these junior college coaches are like, we have some options, right? Like we're not taking a kid with a 2.0. I mean, this is, so it's tougher as well to get into junior colleges academically because there are more kids trying to get in.
Right. All right. So one thing for our audience, if you're not familiar with Bud's work, and this is something that started, as you mentioned, while you had your time at SB Nation, and this is kind of really where I became familiar with you and your work through recruiting, was the blue chip ratio. And if you guys are not familiar with the blue chip ratio, it is a recruiting based metric. Really, it's a talent evaluation metric in a way, as far as, team quality. But what you're looking for there is the share of the roster that were a 4 or 5-star recruit at the time of their commitment, right? So, and what you find is those trend lines between the teams that we really consider contenders, the programs that we really consider to be at the upper crust of the P5 level of the college football playoff conversation and things like that. And I've mentioned it before, and it was for one reason, and it's kind of the degrees of difference between some of these schools that cross the blue chip ratio. So there are some schools that are kind of in the 50s to 60 range, some schools in like the high 60s range. And then you've got these 3 programs that are far and away ahead of everybody else in terms of the blue chip ratio. And that's Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia, which happen to be the top 3 teams in 2021 as far as your recruiting ratings at 24/7 Sports. So my question to you is, do we need to create another chip rate? Like, is there another color chip that we can create for those 3 schools? And, how far away, really, when we're talking about 80% versus 65% in terms of like talent disparity?
Sure. So basically the best way I could put it is nobody is one recruiting class away from entering that really upper threshold. They're about 2 classes away. So if LSU, Oklahoma, Clemson, if they really mash the gas, they could do it. I think Clemson is the one that could probably do it the easiest, but they would have to go against some of their philosophical choices, right? We know there are kids that Clemson just won't take. They do turn down talent in order to keep what they think is the right culture. And I mean, who am I to question? Dabo's got multiple rings this decade, and they really do their thing extremely well. If they took a few a few less like tryhards and really went after a couple more 4 and 5 stars, they could get there. It's like they're almost actively choosing to be in that kind of mid 60s range, and they work just fine there. The reason why I backfit the model, right? Going back 20 plus years, so you can win it if you have 20% or if you have 50%, but I do think it probably takes 50% and a transcendent type quarterback, right? That's what Clemson had. They were like 50.05 when they won with Deshaun, but that's Deshaun, and he's obviously really, really good. So I think anybody on this list could do it. I think your margin for error is much greater if you are Bama, Georgia, or Ohio State, especially if you're able to kind of like QB proof your offense, if you will, because the talent around it is just insane.
That's actually, I'm glad you brought up quarterback proofing your offense. That's a conversation that Seth and I have often about football, especially college football now. And the reason why it seems like there's all this monotonity, I guess, around scheme is because a lot of these teams are trying to do what you just mentioned, which is create these systems where, hey, we can get these athletes. They might not be 5-star or, I might not have Garrett Wilson at receiver, but I've got a kid who's 6'2" and runs a mid 4.5. If I get the guy the ball, he can score. I'm just not going to ask my quarterback to check protections and throw into these tight windows all the time. And so to your point, those teams that are in those kind of mid-tier, above the 50% threshold for the blue chip ratio, those teams are kind of that special quarterback away. When you look at a team like Clemson, who's been in the playoff multiple times, played for championships multiple times, won championships multiple times, that is kind of the one thing that separates them from like an A&M or, some of the other schools that have been close that we've had conversations about, but have not gotten over the hump. Even schools like Georgia, who have been very close, and have definitely had the talent, they came up short at the quarterback position, and it's hamstrung them.
Whoa. There's not going to be any Jake Fromm slander on this podcast, okay?
all I'm saying is the team with the better quarterback won that game and then went on to continue to win national championship. So, it is instructive. I think that sometimes we spend too much time talking about the other things, and there is a space to have conversations along the margins of college football. But this is a talent game, and it's not just a talent game; it's a talent accumulation game. Because part of playing college football is the attrition. It's you're guessing on development for a lot of these kids. Some of these kids, the best year they'll ever have physically is when they're 17 years old, and some of them might not get there until they're 22. We just saw that with Norman Powell at Clemson. You get a kid like that who's a lower star kid, but he gets to eat 3 square meals a day at Clemson and work in one of the most beautiful facilities with great strength and conditioning coaches. All of a sudden you spit out this NFL prospect. So, these are the kinds of things we're talking about where we're separating, maybe the top 10 to 15 programs. And then from there, the top 5, top 3 of those top 15.
I actually track that too. Every year during draft season, I look at the guys who were not blue chippers who became first rounders. I think it's fascinating. Like, how did they get there? And I have like 5 buckets I put things in when I do my analysis, right? Gain 20% or more of body weight post signing is a major one. So you get that backer who's 205 and all of a sudden he's 245 and yet he can still run like he did when he was 205. Right. You got something there. Right? It's just, if you as a scouting director are projecting all of your backers who are 205 to do that, you're going to be fired, because that's pretty rare, Right. Kid like Seth, as you're mentioning, foreign country, right? Yeah. That is one that we often see. I think those kids hit at a higher rate relative to their star rating, and it's tough to project because you don't see them against like competition very often. You're not asked.
Plus, they get coached by people like me, which is probably a problem.
Yeah, they get into a real college program, like, oh my God, who taught you this? All right, so like, there's a lot of factors there. I stress with the blue chip ratio, it's a kind of a SAT term here. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, right?
Right.
You need to have this much talent to now you can make the playoff without this, but I don't think you can win the playoff without having at least this minimum standard of talent. And I made this back when we were consistently on Twitter, I would hear from Baylor fans and TCU fans and Utah fans and Wisconsin fans. And it's like, guys, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but like I'm at all these camps. Like the quality of kid y'all sign, 1 to 85, is different. Like your very best players are just as good as Bama's very best players. Is your 8th best player as good as Bama's 8th best player? No, probably not, right?
And over the course of the season, best player is probably not even close to their 30th best
correct. Player. Exactly. Like Alex Leatherwood is starting from day 1 at all those schools. He's not waiting a couple, yeah.
Absolutely. So I didn't want to spend too much time kind of just ticking off ranking by ranking, especially because some of the margins between these schools are pretty close. But there is one at the top that I did want to mention, and that is Alabama. I saw your tweet at the end of signing day that after they had secured another blue chip prospect that they were going to register as the highest rated single recruiting class since you guys have been measuring that metric at 247. So my question to you is that something significant that they've done? You know, have they changed any of their approaches in recruiting, or is it just as simple as this has been the biggest product in college football for the past 12, 13 years, and now they're just reaping maybe the next cycle of rewards from always being in front of the cameras?
I think it's mostly the latter, right? They have the NFL production, sending guys to the league just over and over and over again. In a world of great uncertainty, I mean, what's the most certain product out there? It's going to Alabama, right? Like you have less opportunity for discovery about other programs, and yet what's the one thing that you don't even have to visit Alabama to know? They're probably going to put you in the pros. Right. That was a big time help. I think the positions of need in their class that they matched up so well with the positions that dominated for them this year. Was really fortunate timing. I mean, look, you create your own luck in some ways, but I mean, like they needed offensive linemen. They went out and had a crazy dominant offensive line. Like I thought that was the most impressive thing about their team this year. Like, they could run all these really long tail play action stuff, and Mac Jones is like, right.
Speaking of QB proofing your offense, create a wall around the quarterback.
Yeah, that is effective. So they did land the top 2 offensive tackle players in the country, so that was helpful. J.C. Latham was we talked about guys growing. I mean, he was like a 6'6", like 250-pound defensive end as a sophomore from Minnesota, and then moved down to IMG, and now he's like 300 something, and really took to the offensive tackle position well, and like likes to play it. A lot of times we have these guys, and like you're an offensive tackle, you just don't know it yet, right?
Right.
And a lot of times these dudes will kind of fight it, and he just didn't. He's like, no, I get it. Like I'm going to be an offensive tackle. That's where I make money. So, right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then they landed the number 2 offensive tackle in the country, Tommy Brockermeyer. His twin brother is the number 1 center in the country. They got him too, both from Texas. Texas legacies, by the way. So that was a blow to Tom Herman when they decided not to go to Texas. Number 1 corner in the country happened to be from nearby Penson Valley. In Alabama, so that was helpful to them. And then they came down to Florida, and they landed like 4 of the top receivers in the state of Florida and 4 of the top 10 in the whole country. And they're all like very diverse skill set guys that none of these guys are actually the same as the other. And then they went and they beat Kirby Smart for Terrence Ferguson, who was the number 2 guard in the country. So really reloading at the positions that they just lost an absolute ton at.
Yeah, you start giving me the rankings of some of these kids, and I've had these conversations with other people, especially in California, you know, over the last 3 to 4 years, which I know you've talked about, the run that some of these Midwest and Southern schools have had on the premier talent here. You know, it hurts my heart as a USC fan after DJ commits to Clemson that there's clips floating around talking about USC is what I grew up on, you know, but when we're talking about what you have to offer one versus the other, yeah, if I'm Bryce Young, if I'm DJ Uiagalelei, I always butcher the name. I am going to lean those directions, even if I absolutely love, you know, the Memorial Coliseum and staying close to home. We're just talking about 2 different things in terms of how it projects my future. And with that does kind of segue into kind of talking about just the greater context that comes around these recruiting rankings and accumulating talent, and that is the college football playoff conversation we have with the top programs in the Power 5. This is my opinion. I don't know if everybody will share it, but after the last, 7 years of playoffs, I feel like we have we can kind of guarantee 3.5 spots is what I'll say. So the best team in the Big Ten, which is typically Ohio State, we mentioned them. The best team in the ACC, which has been Clemson. Those two are usually in as long as there's no disaster game, right? You don't give up 55 points to Iowa. You don't trip over yourself against Pittsburgh. Those types of things don't happen. And usually for these schools, they can overcome it anyways because their resume is usually so strong as far as blowing out the rest of their conference competition that they can save themselves, right? And then it's kind of like 1.5 SEC teams. Usually the SEC West leader will be in. So whether it's LSU, Alabama, Auburn, whoever it is who survives that slate, plus the SEC East leader if they win the conference title. If you're a Georgia, you can maybe lose the conference championship and still be in, obviously off of your reputation. Same with Florida. But for the most part, you're going to get one and you might get two depending on what comes out of the SEC East. So do I have any disagreements before I move on with that? Or do you guys feel like that is a pretty accurate representation of how it's going?
I mean,
I think it's pretty accurate. The one pushback I think I would make is I don't know if Penn State or Michigan or Wisconsin win the Big Ten, are they automatically in, or is this rule a bit of a truism in that the Big Ten champ has been in, but because it has been Ohio State?
I guess I'd say yes if they beat Ohio State convincingly, I would say. And by
assuming it's like a one-loss Ohio State?
Right, exactly. And by convincingly, don't mean 3 scores, but you win by 10, you win by 14. It's not something where a ball gets tipped on a 4th down that turns into some 40-yard gain late in the game where people can say, hey, that actually could have gone either way. Leave no doubt with the win over Ohio State, and it's a good Ohio State. Maybe, but not on the merits of their own resume. No, it would have to be tied to the Buckeyes, I think.
And undefeated, probably, yeah.
Yeah. But I wonder if something like that were to happen if now we go look elsewhere. Because it's not Ohio State winning the conference, that we now say, okay, well, Oregon, you won the Pac-12 and you went undefeated. Oklahoma, obviously, they've been in before. We look at them and say, whoever won the Big 12 and went undefeated, and say, okay, well, we don't think you're that good because you're not Ohio State coming out of the Big 10. So we're going to go in this other direction. But honestly, for the most part, what you're saying, I mean, that's what's happened. There's been, 7 teams that have played in the playoff? 9? Something like that, right?
So out of the Pac-12...
Washington and Oregon have made it.
Yeah, Washington and Oregon. Out of the Big 12, Oklahoma. Yeah. So that's 3.
And Notre Dame's Ohio State made it twice. I think is the only non.
Yeah, twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Florida State, Clemson out of the ACC. And then
LSU, Georgia, Alabama.
Bama, Georgia, LSU. I think that's 10.
Okay. But the point is, that's not a lot. I think that's the main thing. It's not a lot. And I agree with Diante saying it's there's only really one spot for any team. I made the joke at the beginning of the season that when we weren't sure which conferences were going to play, when only, I think at this point, only the SEC and the ACC and maybe the Big 12 were coming back. And it was well, the playoff isn't going to look any different. It ended up being different, obviously, because of Ohio State. But it's there's nothing was going to really change. So, yeah, I'm with you. It bothers me a little bit. It bothers me because I'm I should care more about... if even LSU, which I think has national title hopes every year, I'm I think, I hate to say this, but when they played in the Fiesta Bowl a couple of years ago, which ended up being a super fun game, and it was cool to see them play in a venue that I've never seen them play before. I was all right, I was watching the game, all right, this is fine, but it's not where I want to be. But I think how I always ask this, but how can I? This is just a therapy session now, but how can I?
No, it's a really good point.
How can I stay in college football? I'm not talking about myself personally because I love college football, I watch it, whatever. But how can we get all this whole sport together rather than just being a 4-team sport?
I was tweeting about this the other day, and maybe Twitter's not the best place for it because you only get 280 characters. But
right,
we didn't really have this mindset back when we had the BCS. Or the Bowl Alliance. And I think most of that was related to the fact that yes, ESPN would hype the BCS, but it wasn't the only thing that they talked about. They didn't jam it down our throats during Tuesday night action. All right, here's the BCS standing. Who's in? Who's out? Right? Like now, every commercial is who's in, who's out. I think it creates this mindset as a fan. And if it works on us, people who work in the game, like certainly it's going to create the mindset on the average fan who watch TV. Like, hey, this is what matters, right? This is what matters. And if you're not in, you don't matter. And I don't think college football works as a large scale sport if all what matters is the playoff, right? Like this guy had a tweet, I forgot what his name was on Twitter, but he tweeted me, he said, look, Minnesota and Wisconsin, or whoever it was, are going to play a game for a huge axe. And they're both going to be 8-4, and it's going to be freaking awesome to the fans of their teams. And that's what we can't lose as a sport, right? Like the rivalries between teams that suck, or the rivalries between teams that are just average or just okay, those have to matter. It's part of that collegiate experience. It's tailgating, seeing your friends, like drinking some beers, grilling some burgers, going in and it's the people you only see 2-3 times a year when you go to the games. It's it's telling your kids, hey, I went here, when I was an undergrad, we went to games here. That's the whole thing, which is why I do think we need to expand the playoff, which seems counterintuitive, but I don't think ESPN is going to stop banging this playoff drum constantly. Right. And if they're not, then I think the logical conclusion is that we need to make games later in the season more relevant to more people and more regions, right? So, if you go to 8 and you give the auto bids to the P5s and you have home field advantage, right? Because I don't think we can support them in neutral site games. Right. Then everybody still has to play hard in the final week because you want to get that home field. I mean, Nick Saban's going to want to play that game in Tuscaloosa, not travel to Eugene. So I think that could work. And I was never really I was never a playoff expansion guy. But I think if ESPN, and granted, I work for CBS, so declare your biases, right? But I think if you're going to keep banging this playoff drum like you do, you need to keep hopes alive. And maybe it's a fraud anyway, because I don't know if these other teams are going to win the Natty, but at least you keep their hopes alive and you keep interest alive, so it's not an overly regional sport, which is what I worry that it's becoming.
See, you just touched on it. Your old colleague Stephen Godfrey has had a conversation about this, and I do agree with it. I maybe fall short of where Godfrey's at, where he will declaratively say that it was a mistake for the sport. I think it was a natural progression from the BCS system to be in the playoff. But you are correct. And I can say this, and I think a lot of people have rolled their eyes. I've had this conversation on Twitter a bunch. But to me, the thing that I hold the most dear as a USC fan wasn't so much the national titles. Those were awesome. It was the fact that I knew if my team was good, we were going to be in the Rose Bowl. We were going to kick a team's in the Big Ten's ass. That was it. That was always a peak for me, was some Big Ten team is going to come to LA where USC plays and they were going to get ran off the field, and we were always going to dominate the Pac-12 or the Pac-10 at that time. And that mattered. There was a point in time where that did matter. And it mattered that, hey, that means that we can't sleep when we play UCLA, because they might only be, 8-3, but they've won all their conference games. And that might cost us a chance to play in the Rose Bowl. So that type of stuff matters, in the greater context of the game. And we have I think that we are now a little bit too far into the playoff process not to expand it, because these resumes now have been built based off of prior playoff performances, to where it's hard if you have not been in to break in. If you're a Pac-12 school that, maybe does not have the profile of a Washington, of an SC, of an Oregon, an 11-1 season in most cases would get you into the conversation. But if you're Stanford and you happen to trip and fall forward into an 11-1 season, you are going to be punished for not having been this program prior. We see how forgiving the committee can be to the teams that have made it, or that we would expect to make it. So I think I'm where you're at, but it's probably time to expand it, create these auto bids, so that way these conference games mean a little bit more. These rivalry games mean a little bit more. Teams that win your conference's division but don't win the conference title can still feel as though, hey, we played for something. Our season matters. Our bowl game is going to matter. I do think that we need to start stretching out how much of this stuff matters if the postseason that we're going to be continually banging the drum on.
off that, I have a question. You talk about like USC and playing UCLA, who could be a good team this year because they're actually undefeated in the conference, stuff like that. But there's like, I guess maybe there's two camps where it's like, hey, we're becoming too much. College football right now is just a 4-team discussion every year, like we kind of talked about it. And is it getting worse? Or are you in that space where you're like, yeah, guess what, guys? It's been like this for 120 years. And it just feels worse because of the playoff. Like is that true that it's always been like this? Or has it really gotten worse? Has the talent really been just focused on just a few spots in the past few years?
So I think it has always been like this to some extent, right? I mean, you can go back, and some decades are a little bit crazier than others, and others are just very, chalky, like we've been largely in the playoff era. Mm-hmm. And yet some part of me does think that these teams at the top have a little more stickiness, right, than some other teams do. I think part of that is that they're recruiting a little more nationally, right? I mean, Ohio State's going in and getting, like, Ohio State right now for the class of 2022 has the number one quarterback and the number one receiver in the country, and they're both from Texas, including like the QB is from Austin. Right. And I'm sure Sark will be trying to get him, for the next 10 months. So I think that has created maybe a little more talent clustering at the very top. I also think you have some regional issues. Something I wrote last year, and I'll be writing again this year, is that you are seeing fewer talented big men in California. Right. And there's a lot of, I wrote on this, like I talked to a lot of coaches out there. There's a lot of different factors that they think, and no, I don't think anybody can really prove it. I mean, housing prices, nutritional practices west of the Rockies, probably a little bit, healthier than we have here in the South. A lot of different factors there, whatever you want to pin it on. But, having fewer of those guys out there that are that big at that age and that talented does make a difference. So I think there's some trends that are kind of working against parity, unfortunately. Yeah. But I think it's not a new thing. I mean, when Notre Dame was dominating post World War II, right? Like they probably had more talent clustered than anybody does now. Right. It's just, I think there's a little bit of stickiness to it.
So that kind of leads to talking about, tying these recruiting rankings and conversations about recruiting to this context, is the schools that we've mentioned so far, Oregon, who's made the playoff before, Notre Dame's made the playoff multiple times. Oklahoma's obviously made it 3 years in a row and 4 times overall. These teams are all like in the top 12. USC I'll throw in there as well because I believe they're 8th or 9th this recruiting class. So of this group, and you can say none if you feel as though there's none, which of these would be most likely to make multiple playoff appearances in the next 5 years?
All right, so Oregon, USC, Notre Dame, and Oklahoma, you said?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I think probably just because they've done it recently and because I know their quarterback recruiting has been really good, I'll say Oklahoma.
Okay.
They've made some noticeable improvements on defense, I think, schematically. Now, part of that was probably a little bit of turnover luck, especially in 2019, I think it was, where I was talking to Bill Connolly, and he's like, yeah, they improved some stuff, but at the same time, they were also very lucky with turnovers. They have done a better job recruiting on the defensive side of the ball. I think they have more of a plan of what they're doing, and I think their defensive staff with Grinch has updated. I really trust Lincoln Riley to score points. Their offensive line coach, Bill Biedenbaugh, I think is one of the absolute best in the game. I mean, that guy has a plan. They have a type of recruit they're looking for. They develop it very well. I mean, when's the last time Oklahoma was bad on the offensive line? Like some years they're just decent, and some years they're awesome. But they are consistently blocking it up for their 5-star quarterbacks. And Lincoln Riley somehow, he manages to scheme open so many wide ass open deep shots every game, and it's like they're not reading this out. Like he's just figuring out what you're running and figures out how to trick you. And then they've got a guy who's just wide the hell open, and they do it a couple times a game, and it's extremely effective. Obviously, you don't need a 5-star quarterback to throw that route,
right? What about you, Seth? Which of those 4 would you pick?
I mean, it's Oklahoma because of what you just said. I think the quarterback that they're the quarterbacks that they've put in that system. I think you can get like you said, he'll find places for them to throw the football. But if not, they're so freakishly talented. And look, we've shat on Baker Mayfield quite a bit since he's become an NFL quarterback. Though he had a pretty good year this year. He can move around a bit back in the day at Oklahoma, and he could sling it. He didn't, no touch on the ball. I mean, that was always Baker's thing, no touch on the ball. But he could throw a rocket in there. So like you guys that are being able to move around and. I've seen a little bit of the kid they're bringing in next year,
Caleb Williams
from DC, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's another thing. Now you talk about nationally recruiting. I mean, Oklahoma going to get a kid from DC, like the best quarterback, because they're like the quarterback, the QBU right now. And look, Spencer Rattler is one of the freakiest kids that I've seen throw a football in a long time. I mean, he can sling it. He doesn't know. He might not know what he's doing right now in the pocket, but it doesn't matter because Lincoln's going to get him his shots, and if he doesn't see it right away, it doesn't matter. He gets out the pocket and he's making these throws like, it's unbelievable. So yeah, I mean it's a cop out since you just said all these same things, but Oklahoma's got to be there going forward.
Yeah, Oklahoma's my pick too. I mean, scheduling for one, you really only kind of got to circle one game, and that's the Texas game for them. It kind of seems like, Oklahoma State is decent, but it does kind of feel like maybe they're losing their grip on the rope a bit in terms of recruiting and developing talent. Their offenses haven't been as explosive as they were, at the peak of Mike Gundy's tenure there. So we'll see, with Sark being in Texas, whether or not that kind of changes the math. But based on schedule, their talent, the fact that they are a quarterback factory right now, if you're a 16-year-old kid and you're looking for a place where if you go play there for 3 years, you can be a day 1 or day 2 NFL pick. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to find a place that's better for you than Oklahoma. So for that alone, I would say that they're first. Notre Dame's interesting to me as an independent. I definitely would not pick a Pac-12 team, mostly because I think in terms of the quality of talent on rosters, the best 3 schools there are Oregon, Washington, and USC. They're all usually pretty close to each other when they're at their best. And, there is kind of like that cannibalization factor between, scheduling wise, they play 9 conference games, which means it's more likely that you're going to play a team that's close to you, or you got to go on the road on a Thursday, to play that Fox game that nobody likes, where the better teams usually end up kind of tripping up. There's a Utahs that are lurking out there, Washington State's lurking out there. So there are more opportunities to get tripped up in the Pac-12 than I think there are in the Big 12, and definitely for Notre Dame because they get to make their own schedule.
Speaking of that,
I'd agree with that.
So on our Cover 3 podcast today on CBS, I had Bill Connolly on as our guest. And do you know which league has the highest average SP Plus rating per team?
What's that?
Pac-12.
Really?
Projected this coming year. Because there's no basement, right? They don't have a Vanderbilt or Mississippi State or Rutgers or Syracuse, like all their teams are like at least top 80 nationally, which means you kind of don't really get any weeks off. You just also don't have those teams that are like top 5 level.
Right.
All right. So we wanted to get your opinion on some of the new coaching hires that have been made the past few months. The 4 that we were really interested in: Texas, Tennessee, Auburn, and Arizona. So starting with Texas, and we just talked about Oklahoma and how they're dominating in that conference. Do you like the Sark hire first of all, and then do you think they can get to that level once again?
So I think you have to be willing to admit that there may be some things you don't know, right? And I think if you look at the jobs that Sark got, like all jokes aside, there has to be something that guy does that other coaches say, wow, like he's awesome, right? Like he has to have major recs to be able to get, Washington, USC, Bama OC, Atlanta Falcons, and then Texas. Right. So I think just even though I don't know Sark personally, man, if it's I'm going to assume he's right. Obviously, he's been in recovery and got nothing but glowing remarks from Saban and those guys. I think he probably has a boatload of coaching talent. The issue is, can he navigate all the other shit that comes? Can I cuss on here? That comes with Texas, right? You hear it like Can you deal with the boosters? Everybody there, because they're so so rich, they all feel like they're important. Can you keep them at arm's length? Do you have enough cachet to say I'm running it my way, right? And just enjoy the wins. Get out of my way. I don't know, but I think he's about as good of a candidate there as anybody.
Okay, Tennessee. Me and D talked about this a little bit. My thing with Heupel is I'm such a fan of his offense and what he does. But then the other question is are they just too far in the hole? And is it going to be a thing where Heupel just gets them to like a little, he just like puts a Band-Aid over it, and then it's the next guy who ends up being the guy that if Tennessee is to make the next jump, it's that guy and not Heupel.
I think he probably walks with his guaranteed $22 million after 3-4 years.
Yeah.
Most likely. I mean, look, I think they'll sell tickets. I think they'll have an exciting offense. I think he'll give them a nice distraction during this coming time. But you don't fire 10 people, including your head coach and multiple coaches and a lot of your recruiting staff, for cause, because you're saying, look, we got the cards to say we don't have to pay you because we have evidence of all these violations, and then not get punished for those violations. Like, you can't have it both ways, right? It's like, look at all this bad stuff. Don't punish us for it. Like that's not going to happen. I will say I did not think that UCF under Heupel recruited very well in the state of Florida. I thought they should, given their level of dominance, I thought they should have done better. And they really didn't. Like, they weren't the ones cleaning up the kids who, Florida State, Miami, and let's say like Wisconsin and Iowa didn't get. Right? Like that's where UCF should live. It's like, hey, why go to Wisconsin? Why go to Iowa? Why go to Minnesota? You can stay close to home and play here, even though we're not Power 5. We've been going in the year 6 bowls. They really didn't get a whole lot of those kids. So I'm interested to see how they do recruiting there, but I think they'll sell tickets and be exciting on offense.
Staying in the SEC, Auburn's one of the most fascinating programs to me, because if you look at like everything after like the Pat Dye era, and maybe like the peak of the Terry Bowden era, every coach that they've hired has basically produced at the same level, short of like maybe a national championship appearance or win here or there. So my thing that I've always been interested in, as far as Auburn fan displeasure, is their expectations for the program. So with bringing in Brian Harsin, will he have the same kind of runway? And if he's just as productive there as all the other coaches have been, do you think that he's going to leave, with the acrimonious fan base ready to see him go by the end, the same way it was with Malzahn most recently?
Probably. And yet I still think I do think there's a bit of a shell game to this, right? You have to keep your boosters, and particularly your big boosters, interested in donating to the program, right? You got to give them belief that things are going to get better. You have to have like an ultimate mountaintop goal that you can chase. And after a while, it's like, okay, is Gus really going to take us to the next level? Now, we can all go out and say, look, is Brian Harsin really better than Gus Malzahn? Gus had excellent results. He knows how to coach in the SEC, right? Like, he's very good. But I think he was just kind of stale there. He failed at some quarterback development stuff recently. It seems like he was recruiting guys that maybe didn't fit some of the stuff he wanted to run at times. And then the guys he did recruit, they didn't really develop very well. And then they had major offensive line issues for a couple of years in a row. And they knew that. Additionally, they, I think, signed one kid from the state of Georgia this year, which I know had a lot of their power players over there pretty pissed. And like they think that Mobile is not getting any easier because LSU recruits there, down in Alabama. Obviously, you have to deal with Nick frickin' Saban in your own state who just signed the best class of all time. And Kirby Smart's not slowing down. So making sure that you are like the second best recruiter in Georgia and not losing kids to Tennessee or Clemson, those type of kids from the state of Georgia is important to them. I think that was that, and just kind of keeping it fresh, giving the fan base and the supporters reason for hope was probably the main reason. I'm not convinced he's that big of an upgrade over Gus, if he is at all. But I think he'll do fine. Auburn gets good players. They just committed to a $91 million football-only facility. They're going to be fine.
Oof.
Yes.
Must be nice. Must be nice. So we'll make one last stop on the West Coast here with Jed Fish taking over at Arizona. I think based on some of their staff hires, they're trying to take the same approach as Arizona State as far as getting, we want to get the best defensive coordinator we can, the best offensive coordinator we can. We'll hire guys, that have pro experience and things like that, and try to create this CEO, type of position for Fish and delegate all these tasks. So my question with you is, with how promising it's looked at Arizona State, is there a pathway for Arizona to contend in the Pac-12 South as well? What's their ceiling?
I don't really see a simultaneous path. I think Arizona State got the head start, and that is largely Arizona's own fault. I don't think they should have hired Kevin Sumlin. I think Sumlin should have taken a year off, and Arizona should have known that. Right? I
agree there.
And like they're paying the price for their bad hire in Sumlin at the time. Like maybe someone can bounce back and be a good coach again. I think he probably can. But like Arizona State has a really big head start. They've made a lot of promising young hires that have connected very well in Southern California, which honestly kind of prompted USC to go out and change up some of its staff in this past year for recruiting purposes. So I don't know. I think it's going to be kind of tough.
Before we get out of here, I have a question about Arizona. Do you find and I'm only asking this because I watched way too much election coverage in November, but there was so much talk about how the demographics of Arizona is changing. Do you think that that's going to play a big deal in recruiting? Like, can the Arizona schools be players, not just in the Pac-12 but in the national world?
National, I would say probably no. In the Pac-12, yes, but not both at the same time. Like the demographics are changing, but like you need one to be down so the other can clean up in state and then cherry pick some kids out of California. There's not enough talent to support two really good Arizona programs unless the Cali schools are on probation or something weird.
Bud, thank you. We gotta get out of here. We don't have the money here to keep you on. Before we get out, where can the people find you?
Sure. On Twitter @BudElliott3 and also on the Cover 3 podcast, 247sports.com.
Thank you, Bud.